that's illegal, yet we all know what not being infringed upon in the Second Amendment means. What are you going to do to protect us?
Well, here's the deal. If it's federal law, I'm not obligated to support that, with a couple of exceptions. If you consume your own wheat, then I have to step in. Isn't that silly? If you have an ICE hold on you or an immigration hold on you, I have to hold you for 48 hours, notwithstanding Saturday, Sunday, and holidays. That's, for the most part, the extent that I have to enforce federal law. However, if you good people pass state law, that restricts firearms, then I have to support that. I have to enforce that. If I see an ex-felon walking down the road today and he's packing a firearm, I'm going to write a search warrant for his house, I'm going to get his firearm, and I'm going to take him to jail. You have my word on that. If I find out that you sold him that firearm and you knew he was an ex-felon, I'm going to write a search warrant for your house, I'm going to take you to jail also. You have my word on that.
Along with this gentleman, I find the four most important words is shall not be infringed. And as the first gentleman said, it's up to us to get the word out. We're not speaking to the choir. True, very true is it. We have to educate the low information people. Question is, how do we get to these people? You talked about drones. We have drones in our legislature.
Yeah, don't we?
Okay. How do we get to them?
Well, unfortunately, in the state of California, you have a supermajority of Democrats. And if they propose gun legislation, a lot of this stuff's coming out of the Bay Area and the LA Basin. I'm concerned that if that goes to the governor's office, that he will sign that. They're not going to get it all, but they may get part of it. Now check this out. My brother came down from Montana. He picked up a horse from me and took it back. I asked him if he could bring me some 22 ammunition, because I can't find any 22 ammunition. He struggled across the country to find 1,000 rounds of 22 ammunition. And you know where 500 rounds of it came from? Mexico. You're not supposed to have 22 ammunition in Mexico. You're not supposed to have firearms in Mexico. You know how many firearms are in Mexico? Do you know how many firearms that the United States of America provided to Mexico? I will guarantee you they don't manufacture any firearms in Mexico. But rest assured, there's a bunch of them out there. So when we talk about this overregulation of gun control, you know, I get it. The politicians have got to do, they feel like they have to do something in light of all those terrible, terrible things that happened. That young man that killed all those children at school, he was mentally disabled, and his mother provided him with assault weapons and gave him ammunition and showed him how to use those. Now that should be a crime. If you want gun legislation, let's up the ante on that end of it. If you sell a gun and you know that you're selling it to a felon, let's up the ante on that side of it. Let's make that a crime that we can hold you accountable for. If you buy a gun from a stranger, or you steal a gun and you're in possession of it, you're a felon, let's up that ante. Let's spend more time and energy at that end and not at the front end. Let's do it at the back end. So the answer to the gentleman's question here, if you pass the law, I took an oath to support you and the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California. If you pass that law, I have to enforce it. If it's state law.
Doesn't state law have an equivalent to the shall not of the gun, the Second Amendment in the state also? And if our legislators go against that, what is our recourse except millions of dollars through a
vote them out.
Screwed up court system?
Vote them out.
No, we got to rebel.
The Undersheriff's going to talk to you a little bit about McDonald, right? You're actually right. There's a certain case that says that the states can't infringe no more than the government can, and that's a case called McDonald. But
you were saying that if we vote any which way we do, your job is to protect us and our votes. And yet, twice California, just for instance, has voted down gay marriage. And yet now, the government's about to say, too bad. Against the will of the people. What if
yeah, I'm not so sure that the government's going to do that. But
I hope they don't. But what if they find ourselves in the same position, but this time about our Second Amendment?
you know, honestly, I don't believe that the government is... You start down a slippery slope, don't you? And I don't care where you start. If you start on backgrounds or you start registration processes, that's the slippery slope. Very difficult to come back. So as the son of a Montana cattleman, I'm against gun regulation. As your sheriff, we gotta be real careful about the battles we fight and which hill we choose to climb. There's no question over this.
Sheriff, in the interest of time, you can be here for a few more minutes after we're done. Can we hold the questions till in the audience?
Sure.
Did you want to have?
I do. I would like the Undersheriff to come up and speak to you about two cases of particular importance to you. One's called Heller versus Washington, the other one's called McDonald.
Thank you, Sheriff. Hear me? Good. The two cases certainly I think are important. Yes, sir?
I have a question. It's toward to the sheriff.
I'll honor
Sir,
this.
Him will be there. We're going to hold all questions till we adjourn. The sheriff and the undersheriff will be here in the interest of time. Thank you.
So, the two cases the sheriff, I think, wanted me to talk about and are important cases because I think they speak to some of the concerns that that are being raised right now. And they deal with the Second Amendment. And as the sheriff noted in 2008, a case called District of Columbia versus Heller was decided. And it's pretty remarkable to me, frankly, that it took that long for the debate between whether or not the Second Amendment, which you all, I'm sure, admit is a relatively short amendment in terms of how long it is, for such a short amendment with so few words to cause so much confusion for so long interests me as someone who is interested in constitutional law. And the fact that it wasn't until 2008 that the United States Supreme Court finally came out and said, listen, this isn't about raising a militia. This is about an individual's right to keep and bear firearms. And it also interests me that people still cling to that notion that the Second Amendment is somehow tied up in the militia or the need for a militia to have firearms. And I often hear that argument said, what good is a assault weapon going to do against a drone? But that's not what this is about. And the Supreme Court made that obvious, or made that clear in Heller when they said it was an individual right. Later on, in another case called McDonald versus Chicago, the Supreme Court made it clear that that right was extended to the states through another amendment, called the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which I think is a very interesting discussion in that particular case, and I'll get into it briefly. I don't certainly want to bore those of you who aren't enthralled with the various nuances of the Constitution. But within the Heller decision, after the court declared that it's about an individual right to possess firearms, it went on to say that certain regulation of firearms was within the Constitution, was within the meaning of the Second Amendment. And the justices specifically said that their ruling didn't mean that a person could possess any weapon they wanted for any purpose they wanted, under any circumstance they wanted. They left room for the states to pass laws dealing with, for example, concealed carry of firearms, or the possession of firearms by felons or persons with mental illness, or the carrying of firearms in certain locations like schools and government buildings. And then ultimately, in McDonald, they looked at how restrictive the states could be with regard to the possession of firearms, and they ruled that the state cannot outright ban the possession of firearms. And I find it interesting that this case came out of Chicago. I'm sure many of you have looked at the fact that Chicago has probably the highest murder rate in the country right now. I mean, it is out of control. And they have, for many years, it's had a very, very restrictive gun law. And even now, they have restrictive gun laws. I think it goes back to what Caleb said, is when you start restricting guns, there may be a correlation between that and violent crime that goes up. But I will say this with regard to the McDonald case, because I think it's important. There was some debate amongst the justices as to what provision of the 14th Amendment the Heller case and the Second Amendment apply to the states. And there's one provision or one clause of the 14th Amendment called the Due Process Clause, which essentially says that before certain rights can be infringed upon or certain things can be taken away from you, you have to be afforded due process. It's called the Due Process Clause. The other clause in the 14th Amendment is called the Privileges and Immunities Clause. And one of the justices argued that that's really the clause that should be used to apply the Second Amendment to the states. And I have to tell you that I actually agree with that justice's opinion, because he came to or articulated it in this way. Deeply rooted in our country's history and tradition, responsible gun ownership is fundamental to our country's scheme of ordered liberty and integral to our fundamental right of self-defense. And that's the issue we're talking about. Your ability as a law-abiding citizen to possess a firearm goes to your fundamental right to defend yourself. That's what we're talking about.
From the government.
From anybody. From anybody.
Or anything.
Like a dog, perhaps, right? Like a dog, right. And I think that's the key to the argument. And when you talk about educating the other side, that's the context that I think is important to do it. They can talk about their views on gun control and gun legislation. And I would submit to you that most of the time it's motivated out of a lack of understanding and an emotional response. And when, as Caleb suggested, you know the facts and you are able to articulate your position clearly, I think you have a better chance of at least making your point. And when someone says to you, listen, it was about a militia, no, it wasn't. It was about your right to self-defense. And I absolutely think what happened in some of these incidents where people people who engaged in criminal activity or suffered from mental illnesses, used guns to harm innocent people is an absolute tragedy. There's no way that we're going to sit up here and tell you that that doesn't have a significant impact on us, and that's not something that we in the Sheriff's Office aren't keenly aware of and certainly do everything in our power to prevent. But taking away one individual's right to self-defense in response to a tragic event doesn't make any of us safe. Right?
Right. That's correct.
It doesn't make any of us safe. And so it comes down to what the sheriff and I have talked a lot about, and ultimately what was part of the statement that he put out, and that is this. Protecting the Second Amendment starts here. It starts in the community. It starts with the public. It doesn't start with elected officials. It doesn't start with the government. The fact of the matter is, we as a community members, we have to advocate and advance the cause of responsible gun ownership. And that means we have to regulate that within the community, not look to the government to regulate it for us. That means that when there are people who are out, who are in possession of guns, who would do harm to others unlawfully, we need to stand up against that and do what we can to prevent that from happening. It also means that when we see a friend or a family member or loved one who's in crisis as a result of a mental health issue, we have to have the courage to stand up and do what we can to keep that person from using a firearm to harm themselves or harm someone else. We have to be part of that solution. Now, we talked a little bit about the whole preaching to the choir thing. And I'm going to tell you that I had the opportunity to attend an event held at Butte College not long ago called the Suicide Prevention Summit. And Caleb, you're right. The vast majority of gun deaths are suicides. And of those, when a person uses, or when a person is intent upon committing suicide, typically that decision is made with very little reflection. It's in the space of a few minutes is when they ultimately make that decision. And if they opt to use a firearm, they're 85% effective. 85% of the time, that works. As opposed to other methods, for example, hanging or taking pills is 2% of the time. Hanging is 64% of the time in terms of the success rate. And so this group asked me to come and talk to them about finding ways to reduce people's access to means to commit suicide. Now, I got to tell you, it was a very different crowd. I absolutely respect what those folks were doing. I'm confident that there's no one in here who would want a person who was in crisis, a person who was suffering from a mental illness, to take a gun and kill them. Nobody wants that, correct? Absolutely not. And if we can do something to help that person through that crisis, to avert that, wouldn't we all do that?
Yes.
Absolutely. So these people have that goal in mind. They were certainly there to try to address that problem, to prevent those tragedies from being visited upon families. And many, many of them thought that the way you deal with that issue was to take guns away from people. And so you might imagine that when I stepped up and I talked to them from my perspective, and I said, listen, I don't think that's the way to deal with this issue. Not everybody was too keen on what I had to say. What I told them is, I think if you go down that road, you politicize the issue. You get people thinking about the wrong thing. What we're trying to do here is help people in crisis, right? And if you go down the road of taking away guns, people lose sight of ultimately what you're trying to do. And I also told them, you have to be respectful of other people's rights. You have to be respectful of other people's constitutional rights. And working to address that problem and protecting other people's constitutional rights to have firearms aren't mutually exclusive. So we shouldn't marry those two issues together. I bring that up because that's the kind of thing that I think we can all do in terms of getting outside and preaching to someone other than the choir, right? To advancing this concept that the Second Amendment is about the right to defend oneself, and that responsible gun ownership and all that that entails advances that cause. And that to go to try to take someone else's rights away, and as the sheriff said, we defend people's First Amendment rights all the time, although there's a lot of times we don't necessarily like what they have to say, right? But we defend those. Well, the same should be true about people's right to defend themselves, and if they choose to use a firearm to do that, we have to respect that. So, those are my brief kind of overviews of the two cases, my thought on a few issues, and with that in mind, Mr. Teeter, how are you, sir? Teeter. Yeah. I have nothing else, and I'll turn it back over to you.
And again, ladies and gentlemen, after the meeting, the sheriff and the undersheriff and Caleb Chinn will be available for your questions.
Okay, I got a question for you.
Excuse me, sir. No,
Listen.
well, no, we don't want questions right now. If you would please sit down.
Right here that is wrong. I want to correct you, because I don't want this crowd to go out thinking that what he said about Constitution is right.
Sir, we're not here to discuss that, please.
Let me speak to the
Just
sheriff,
sit
please.
down.
Sheriff, will you answer my question? I'm challenging you that you say the Constitution is fluid. It is not.
Well, sir,
We can change it, but it's not fluid. It's not
Sir, please sit down. You're disrupting the meeting. Thank you.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, gentlemen. And again, they'll be available after the meeting. Ben Duke is going to give you a brief PowerPoint presentation. I need to preface this with, he's an attorney. You haven't done anything wrong, but you'll feel guilty when he's done. Mr. DeDuca.
I love that guy. Before I start the presentation, let me speak to those of you who are in the audience who are pissed off. If there are 150 people in this room, 45 of you did not vote. You sat around with your buddies, you were mad about the matter, you griped to the old lady, and you didn't vote. If you want to change anything in this country, register and vote or shut up. That was the nice part of my presentation.
And vote often.
Vote off. Okay, so I'm going to get this thing to work. Yeah, you may be spared by PowerPoint. Okay.
Nice try.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is an historic moment in our country's history. We've reached a crossroad in these United States of America, and we're now compelled to ask an important question of our leaders. And I want you to listen carefully to this. It's a question that will affect us, our children, and our future generations. It draws the line in the sand for many of us here tonight. It's going to test our wills and improve our conscience. Our greatest leaders have stepped forward to answer this question without being asked to do so. Thank you, Sheriff Smith, Undersheriff Honea. And those who didn't step up immediately have stepped forward courageously and without hesitation. Thank you, Councilman Bowling. These are the men and the women